Picture the streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. The marble stones are warm beneath the sandals of senators and merchants, while gossip ripples like smoke through the forum. At the center of this commotion walks the emperor himself, robes heavy with gold thread, face painted with the confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. Beside him glides a figure draped in silks and jewels, delicate, poised, radiant in the manner of an empress. But the whispers chase them like shadows. Everyone knows the truth. This was no woman. This was Sporus, a boy whom Nero had reshaped, remade, and forced into the image of his dead wife. To the people, it was both spectacle and horror. The emperor of Rome, the man who ruled over 60 million souls, was parading a young man as his bride. What lay behind this grotesque display wasn't merely scandal. It was grief turned into obsession, love twisted into possession, and power warped into cruelty. Sporus' story is not only about the cruelty of one emperor, it is about what happens when a man with unchecked authority bends another human being into a living doll to soothe his own madness. We often think of Roman decadence as feasts overflowing with wine, or emperors demanding statues of themselves carved into the likeness of gods. But this tale is darker than all of that. It is the story of one boy's stolen life and of an empire forced to play along with the emperor's delusion. Before we step into the labyrinth of this tragedy, it is worth asking, why does this story matter to us today? Because history has a way of repeating itself. The shapes may change, the costumes may differ, but the danger of one person's will crushing another's identity, of grief transforming into control, of power silencing the powerless, is timeless. Sporus is not just a ghost from Rome. He is a reminder of the fragility of self when confronted with absolute domination. The name Sporus is forgotten in most classrooms and history books, but once spoken in whispers across the eternal city, it carried both pity and unease. To understand how he came to walk beside Nero in silks and jewels, we must step back in time. We must meet the man at the center of it all, an emperor who began his reign with promise, only to become a cautionary tale of how obsession corrodes the soul. Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, would one day be remembered for fire, cruelty, and madness. But in the beginning, Rome hoped for something very different. When Nero first ascended the throne at the tender age of 16, Rome believed it was witnessing the dawn of a golden age. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, heir to a dynasty that had shaped the empire itself. The people saw in him not the shadow of tyranny, but the promise of renewal. In his early years, Nero cut taxes, sponsored magnificent games, and poured money into public works that beautified the city. He even opened the doors of the palace to the common folk, staging theatrical performances in which he himself sang and played instruments. For the masses, this was a dream emperor, youthful, approachable, and eager to entertain. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Absolute power is like acid. It corrodes slowly, invisibly, until one day, the structure collapses. Nero was surrounded by flatterers, courtiers, and advisors too fearful to contradict him. Imagine being 16, catapulted into command over 30 legions, with every senator bowing to your every word. To many, such power would feel like a divine blessing. To Nero, it was both intoxicating and suffocating. The strain began to show. Ancient sources describe a young man torn between two identities, the statesman Rome needed and the artist he longed to be. He adored theater and chariot racing more than governance, passions that scandalized the Senate but thrilled the crowds. His nights grew long with revels, his days consumed with performances. And yet, despite the frivolity, there was an undercurrent of unease. Paranoia began to whisper in his ear. Each shadow seemed to hide a rival. Each cheer from the crowd carried the possibility of mockery. The court of Nero became a place of watchful eyes and unsaid truths, where one careless word could mean exile or worse. Perhaps this paranoia came from knowing he stood on a throne, built not only by ambition, but also by blood. Rome's emperors had never been strangers to assassination, and Nero, though young, understood too well that power in Rome was a prize everyone coveted. The isolation grew unbearable. No one dared to correct him, no one dared to defy him, and so he was left in a gilded cage where every reflection confirmed only what he wished to see. Into this void of fear and longing stepped a woman who seemed to embody everything Nero craved: beauty, cunning, and fire. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she would become both his muse and his ruin. To understand the tragedy of Sporus, we must first understand the woman whose death planted the seed of obsession in Nero's heart. Papatia Sabina was no ordinary woman in the Roman court. Born into wealth and privilege, she was famed for her beauty, but what set her apart was something far more dangerous: her mind. Roman historians described her skin as luminous, her presence as commanding, and her wit as razor-sharp. She was the kind of woman who could step into a crowded room and turn it into her stage, bending the currents of conversation, commanding attention not just with her looks, but with her intellect. In a society where women were often expected to play quiet roles, Papadia made herself impossible to ignore. When Nero first encountered her, he was already married to Octavia, the daughter of Emperor Claudius. Octavia was the embodiment of dignity and restraint, a noblewoman suited for alliance, but hardly a match for Nero's restless spirit. To him, Octavia was cold marble, while Papatia was living flame. The contrast could not have been starker. Octavia represented political stability, Papatia promised passion and danger. The affair that followed was scandalous even by Roman standards. Yet for Nero, this was not simply infatuation, it was possession. He lavished Papatia with silks from China, gems from India, and perfumes from Arabia, draining the imperial treasury as though wealth itself could measure his devotion. He placed guards around her, ostensibly for protection, but in truth to control every eye that dared linger on her. To be admired by others was, for Nero, an offense worthy of jealousy. His obsession grew so intense that senators whispered in alarm, fearing what might happen if his hunger for her love remained unchecked. For Papatia, however, this dangerous devotion was both peril and opportunity. She was clever enough to recognize the power Nero's obsession granted her. Unlike Octavia, she did not simply endure the role of imperial consort, she wielded it. Papatia positioned allies throughout the court, advancing her family's fortunes and weaving a network of influence. Her ambition matched Nero's in its audacity, and together they appeared for a time as Rome's most dazzling pair, their union a blend of beauty, power, and menace. But Papatia was not content to play the submissive role expected of women in the empire. She argued with Nero, mocked his theatrical indulgences, and at times seemed unafraid to challenge the emperor in private. This independence, so rare and so alluring, was also her fatal flaw. For a man like Nero, accustomed to obedience, terrified of dissent, her defiance struck at the very heart of his insecurities. And so their marriage became a dangerous dance, passion entwined with suspicion, affection laced with violence. Theirs was not a love that healed or steadied. It was a storm, drawing both of them closer to the abyss. The story of Papatia Sabina's end is one of the most haunting episodes in Roman history, because it reveals not only the brutality of Nero, but also the fragility of love when entangled with absolute power. Ancient sources differ on the details, but all agree on the outcome. A quarrel turned deadly, leaving the Empress broken on the marble floors of the imperial palace. By 65 AD, Papatia was pregnant with what would have been her second child with Nero. The moment should have been one of triumph, the continuation of the dynasty, the promise of stability. Yet within the palace, the tension had grown unbearable. Papatia, unlike the cowed courtiers, had never learned the art of silence. She mocked Nero's endless performances, ridiculed his hours spent rehearsing songs and lines for the theater, and questioned his priorities as emperor. Perhaps her criticisms came sharper under the strain of pregnancy. Perhaps Nero's paranoia, already festering, had twisted every word into an imagined insult. On that fateful day, an argument spiraled out of control. Some say it began with Nero arriving late from the chariot races, others with Papatia daring to accuse him of neglecting the empire in favor of his vanity. Whatever the spark, the fire spread quickly. In a fit of rage, Nero lashed out physically. According to Tacitus, he struck or even kicked Papatia in her abdomen, a blow so brutal it caused fatal internal injuries. Within hours, both she and her unborn child were dead. What followed was not remorse as most mortals would know it, but something far more unhinged. Witnesses reported that Nero collapsed upon her body, weeping, screaming, begging her forgiveness one moment, and commanding her to live the next, as if the authority that bent the legions and senators to his will might also defy death. He ordered the finest physicians of Rome to save her, threatening them with torture when they failed. But no wealth, no command, no divine claim could undo the violence he had inflicted. Poppaea was gone, and with her, the last fragile tether to Nero's humanity. His grief became an obsession, bordering on madness. He refused to allow her body to be cremated according to Roman custom. Instead, she was embalmed, entombed with lavish splendor, as though death itself could be conquered by gold. He declared her a goddess, erected statues in her honor, and forced the imperial court into a grotesque performance of denial. At banquets, her seat remained conspicuously empty, yet guests were expected to pretend she was present, alive in spirit. To speak of her in the past tense was dangerous. To suggest Nero should remarry was fatal. In this surreal world where the emperor demanded the impossible, the boundaries of reality itself began to blur. And into that distorted reality stepped a boy fragile, young, and unknowing, whose face would ignite the emperor's most dangerous delusion of all. His name was Sporus. Enter Sporus. The living replacement. Sometime after Poppaea's death, Nero's grief settled into a new, more terrifying shape. His mourning was not like that of ordinary men, who learn to live with absence. Instead, he sought to undo the irreversible, to bend reality itself until it conformed to his desire. It was during this time that he first noticed a young freedman in the imperial household, a boy whose life would soon be consumed by the emperor's madness. His name was Sporus. He was probably 14 or 15, born into slavery within the palace walls, and freed as a child, a not uncommon path for those raised in close service to the imperial family. To be a freedman in the emperor's household was a precarious kind of privilege. One could rise to positions of influence, handling accounts, correspondence, or ceremonial duties. Yet one's fate was tied entirely to imperial favor. A wrong word, a failed task, even the shifting moods of a master could cast such a person into ruin. What set Sporus apart was not his education or his skill, though both would have been cultivated. It was his face. Ancient writers agree on one striking detail. Sporus bore a haunting resemblance to the dead Empress Poppaea, delicate bone structure, wide eyes, and a softness that echoed her beauty. In a culture where resemblance was often read as a sign of divine connection, the likeness must have seemed uncanny. To Nero, who had been speaking to his wife's corpse and commissioning cults in her honor, it was nothing short of revelation. Imagine the moment. The emperor, broken by guilt yet intoxicated by his own power, gazing upon a boy who mirrored the features of the woman he had killed. For a flicker of time, Nero may have believed that fate or the gods themselves had offered him a second chance. Here, in Sporus, was the possibility of resurrection. There was, of course, one insurmountable obstacle. Sporus was male. Yet, for Nero, who fancied himself half artist, half divinity, the problem was not a barrier but a challenge. He had reshaped Rome with stone, reshaped its culture with theater. Why not reshape flesh itself? If he could not have Poppaea, then he would make her. In that single decision, Sporus ceased to be himself. He was no longer a boy, no longer a servant, no longer even a person with his own destiny. He became a vessel for the emperor's delusion, a living canvas upon which Nero would project his grief, guilt, and obsession. The forced transformation what followed was not simply cruelty, but one of the most chilling acts of possession in recorded history. Nero did not merely dress Sporus in feminine clothes, as others in Rome might have done for mockery or performance. He wanted permanence. He commanded physicians to perform surgery on the boy, stripping him of his manhood and reshaping him to fit the mold of the dead empress. Roman medicine was crude, closer to butchery than science. Surgical instruments were bronze and iron, sterilization unheard of, pain relief limited to alcohol, herbs, or at best a crude soporific. The procedure Sporus endured would have been an agony lasting hours, with guards holding him down as he screamed. Infection, blood loss, and shock were common killers in such operations. That Sporus survived it all is grim testimony to the determination of those carrying out Nero's will. Yet survival was only the beginning of his torment. In the weeks of recovery that followed, Sporus was stripped layer by layer of his identity. Nero renamed him Sabina, after Poppaea Sabina, erasing his own name and binding him forever to the memory of the dead empress. Imperial seamstresses stitched silks, cut to soften his form, while jewelers set Papia's own gems into ornaments for him to wear. He was adorned with the treasures of the woman he was forced to replace: necklaces that once graced her throat, rings that had sealed her letters, pearls that had swayed in her ears. Tutors were appointed to remake him in every gesture. They taught him how to walk with small, graceful steps, how to lower his eyes modestly, how to arrange his hands in feminine repose. Voice coaches trained him to speak with higher tones, smoothing away the resonance of youth. Cosmetics were pressed onto his skin, rouge and powder turning his features into a mask of womanhood. Each day Sporus woke to mirrors that reflected not himself, but the shadow of another, a stranger wearing his face. This was not transformation, it was annihilation. Every ritual, every lesson was a reminder that his existence had been overwritten. In the eyes of Rome's most powerful man, Sporus was no longer allowed to be Sporus at all. He was Poppaea reborn. And yet, beneath the silks and jewels, beneath the painted face and trained voice, there remained the unyielding truth of a boy who had no choice. Sporus had become a prisoner not of stone walls, but of another man's obsession, a living ghost in a body no longer his own. A marriage and public spectacle. When Nero finally deemed his creation complete, he announced what seemed unthinkable. He would marry Sporus in a full imperial ceremony. The news spread like wildfire through Rome, and though senators and nobles muttered in disbelief, none dared oppose the emperor. To defy him was to risk exile, torture, or worse. And so, the court prepared itself for a wedding that was both a grotesque parody and a deadly serious command performance. The day arrived in the spring of 67 AD. The palace blazed with torchlight, halls garlanded with flowers from across the empire, their perfume heavy in the air. Musicians played traditional wedding hymns, while attendants bustled with trays of delicacies and fine wines. To an outsider, it might have seemed like any other celebration of Rome's ruling class. But those who knew the truth must have felt the chill beneath the spectacle. For here was the emperor, placing a veil upon a teenage boy, calling him Sabina, and declaring him his lawful wife before the gods and the state. Every ritual was observed with careful precision. They joined hands in the clasp of marriage, shared the sacred loaf of bread, and signed the legal documents binding them as husband and wife. Sporus, draped in silks, jewels, and the bridal veil, was expected to smile, to play the role of a woman who had been dead for 2 years. The guests played along, offering their congratulations with stiff faces, their voices caught between fear and forced joy. The air must have been thick with unease, an atmosphere where every laugh and every toast was a mask hiding horror. From that moment, Sporus was treated not as a boy, but as Empress. He was granted his own retinue of attendants, his own quarters within the palace, even his own income drawn from the imperial treasury. He traveled in a litter like any noblewoman, accompanied Nero to state banquets, and sat at his side in public as though he were Poppaea herself. But luxury does not erase torment. Every day was a performance. Sporus was forced to recall memories that were not his own, to respond when Nero reminisced about his life with Poppaea, as though the events had truly been shared. He had to anticipate the emperor's moods, answer with carefully crafted words, and embody a woman he had never known. His survival depended on perfect illusion. And the performance did not end in Rome. When Nero toured Greece, eager to display his talents as a singer and actor before the Greeks, Sporus went with him, presented abroad as the Empress of Rome. Imagine the bewilderment of Greek nobles, forced to bow to the obvious fiction while pretending not to see the truth. Yet Nero's will was law, and so the charade continued, the empire itself bent to uphold one man's delusion. By 68 AD, Nero's world was crumbling. The empire, weary of his extravagance and neglect, began to fracture. Governors in the provinces raised their banners in revolt, the Praetorian Guard turned against him, and the Senate, once his stage, declared him an enemy of the state. The man who had once been adored by the Roman mob now found himself abandoned, a hunted figure clinging desperately to power. Even in his flight, Nero clung to Sporus. The boy, dressed still in silks, traveled beside him as the emperor's empress, a grotesque reminder of the obsession that had consumed them both. They took refuge in a villa outside Rome, waiting for rescue that would never come. Some say Nero, even then, was still half-performer, rehearsing the noble suicide he imagined posterity would remember. When news came that soldiers were approaching, Nero panicked. With no one left to save him, He plunged a dagger into his throat. Rome's last Julio-Claudian emperor, dying not with grandeur, but in chaos and fear. For Sporus, Nero's death was not liberation. It was the beginning of another nightmare. He was too well known, too infamous a symbol of the dead emperor's madness to be ignored. Seized by the victors, he was passed from man to man, each powerful figure treating him as property. Otho, one of Nero's successors and once Poppaea's former husband, claimed Sporus and continued to address him as Sabina. Then Vitellius, the next emperor, took possession. Each in turn demanded the same charade Nero had begun, that Sporus live not as himself but as the resurrected ghost of a woman long gone. Under Vitellius, the cruelty reached its most grotesque point. He planned to force Sporus into a public spectacle, in the arena, a reenactment of the myth of Persephone's abduction, where Sporus would be raped before thousands, mocked not only as a false empress but as a plaything of imperial humiliation. For Sporus, who had already endured years of forced transformation, endless performance and the theft of his identity, this was a final degradation too unbearable to face. And so he chose the only escape left to him: death. Ancient accounts suggest he took poison, though some say he cut his own veins. He was no more than 20 years old. In ending his life, Sporus reclaimed something that had been denied to him since boyhood: the right to choose his own fate. History remembers Sporus less as a person, and more as a symbol, a footnote in the annals of imperial excess. But, if we look closer, we see something more poignant. His story is not only one of cruelty but also of resistance. By taking his own life, Sporus defied the empire's last attempt to use him as a spectacle. In that act, however tragic, lies a spark of dignity. And so his name, though whispered rarely, deserves to endure. For beneath the marble arches and gilded halls of Rome's emperors, his life reminds us of the hidden cost of power, the fragility of identity, and the resilience of a human spirit pushed to its breaking point.